Hi there everybody, welcome to week 2's history lesson where we're going to be continuing our learning from what we looked at last week as we started looking at a different explorer. So in term 3 we looked at Christopher Columbus, didn't we, and we know that he was a sailor, and last week you started looking at this significant person here. So I'd like you to think about these 4 questions based on last week's learning. So who is this significant person that we can see in the pictures? What's his name? What type of explorer was he? What can you remember about him from last lesson? And how is he different to Christopher Columbus? So pause the video and see if you can think about these 4 questions. Okay, so hopefully you've had a little think about these 4 questions. So hopefully you have remembered that his name is Neil Armstrong. So we're going to be thinking this term about why Neil Armstrong is so significant to us today. We can see from the pictures that he is an astronaut, so he travelled into space, and we know that he was the first man on the moon and the first American in space as part of the Apollo 2 mission. And that means that we know he's different to Christopher Columbus. First of all, they're from different time periods. Christopher Columbus is much more recent because Armstrong was born in 1930, whereas we know from when we looked at Columbus, he was over 500 years ago. And they are both different types of explorers. Columbus was a sailor, whereas Armstrong is an astronaut. So we're going to be thinking today in more detail about different key events of space travel. So last week you thought about where we would put Armstrong on our timeline of events. And today we're going to think more specifically about key events of space travel. So not just about Armstrong, we're going to be thinking about the whole of space travel and the key historical events. So I'd like you to look at each picture that you can see on the screen. What do you think each picture is showing? How do you think that each picture might relate to a key event of space travel? Okay, so hopefully you've had a little think about what you can see in each picture. I can see here we've got the moon, so perhaps this date is something to do with somebody travelling to the moon. I can see a picture of a monkey. Perhaps this means that monkeys were somehow involved in space travel. And the same with the dog. And the same with the fly. This is the English flag, isn't it? So I think that this is something to do with English space travel and something that hadn't been done before. I can see a lady in a spacesuit here. So perhaps this is to do with the first woman into space. Not sure what this one's showing us. We will find out a little bit more if you're not sure what it is. I can see a man here and a statue and then something that looks like a rocket here. And we're going to be thinking about what each of these pictures in more detail today. So don't worry if you're not sure at the moment what you think each picture is showing us. Now I'd like you to look at the dates, which we can see in the purple bit along the top. Are the pictures in the correct order at the moment? Are they going in chronological order of how these different key events happened? Hopefully you've spotted that they're not. How do you know? I can see most of them start with 19, except these 2 here. So how do we know they're not in the correct order? I can see 1969, 1949, so I know 1949 would come before this one. Oh, but then I can see 1942, and I know 1942 would come before 1969. So at the moment, our pictures aren't in the correct order. Can you spot then which event happened first and which event is the most recent? See if you can spot those 2 dates. Great. So I can see our earliest space event that we've got here is 1942. So I'm going to highlight that one. Which is the most recent? Oh, I can see I've got 2001 and 2015. Which do you think is the most recent? Hopefully you've said 2015. So we're going to look at these today in more detail and then put them in the correct order on a timeline. So we're going to talk through each picture, what it's showing us, why it was an important historical event, and then put them on the timeline. So our first one, like we identified, was 1942. And this is the first rocket called the V2. And this is the date when the V2 was first launched. And these rockets were used as weapons during the Second World War. And the V2 was the world's first large-scale rocket. So they'd had a go at building smaller rockets and experimenting. And this is the actual V2 rocket here. And this was the world's first large scale. So this was the largest one at that time. No other rocket had been made quite as big as this one. And it was called the V2. And in 1942 is when it was launched. Now I could remember that date by V2. And then 1942. That helps me remember that key date. So that was the first one that we would plot onto our timeline. That's the furthest that we're going to go back to look at key space travel. The next one is a few years later in 1947. And we can see a picture of a fruit fly. And this was the first animal to be sent into space. And they were fruit flies. They went aboard a US launched V2 rockets. They went on board one of these rockets here. And they reached a distance of 68 miles and recovered the journey alive. And then this here is a poster from the time to advertise what was happening. We can see the fruit fly and the V2, and we can see that it happened on the 20th of February, 1947. Okay, our next key historical event then was 2 years later in 1949. The first monkey was sent into space, and we can see him sat here. And he was successfully sent into space and made a height of 83 miles. So we can see as they were progressing, the fruit flies reached a height of 68 miles. They put more research into it, and the monkey managed to go 83 miles. And the monkey was called Albert II. And we can see him strapped in with his little crash helmet on, ready to go into space. Then, later on, 8 years later, we've got the first dog in space called Laika. And that was in 1957. And she launched in November 1957. And she was the first animal to actually orbit the Earth in a rocket. So we had a lot of events that happened quite close together where they sent animals to test and experiment these different things out before they sent humans into space. We started with the fruit flies, the monkey, and then the dog. Then in 1961 was the first man in space. So like we were saying, they experimented with animals first, and then they sent the first man into space called Yuri Gagarin from Russia. And he was the first human to make it into space at 108-minute orbit. So he was orbiting for 108 minutes, and he was only 27 years old. And then we can see a statue here to remember him. Then in 1963, so 2 years later, we then had the first woman into space called Valentina. And she travelled into space on the 16th of June 1963. She launched on a solo mission, so she was alone, and she spent more than 70 hours orbiting the Earth. So we can see as time progresses, all of these different space expeditions were getting better and better, and they were able to get more research and do better things each time. So we started with an 108-minute orbit, then 70 hours orbiting. Now, this is the main event that I want us to remember from today, and one of the key events that is really important that we remember because it links to our learning of Neil Armstrong, and that date is 1969. Let's say it together. 1969. And this was the first moon landing made by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. And they were aboard the Apollo II, which was the first manned spacecraft to land on the moon. And we know that from last week we learned that he was American, which is why when he landed on the moon, they put the American flag on the moon. So this was the main historical event that I want us to remember that happened in 1969, as it's really important linking to our learning around Neil Armstrong. Then in 1991, Helen Sharman became the first British astronaut in space. So that was a big thing for us British people. She was the first astronaut to go into space. Then in 2001, we had the first space tourist. So like our book of the Man on the Moon, although it's fiction, they talked about how tourists went to visit the moon. So they're people that can pay to go and visit. So an American businessman called Dennis became history's first space tourist. So he paid for his own way to the International Space Station aboard a Russian spacecraft. So he wasn't an astronaut, he paid because he wanted to go into space. He was a tourist. Then in 2015, Tim Peake became the first British astronaut to visit the International Space Station. And we can see a picture of him here. So although we'd had Helen in space, he was the first person to actually visit the International Space Station. So what I'd like you to do now is on the daily learning overview, I attached a link to a video. I'd like you to pause this one and go and watch the video, which will show you in more detail about some of these key historical events. Okay, so hopefully you're coming back as you've watched the video. There are lots of interesting facts in there and things for us to look at. And then we've also got our timeline down the side here. Can you spot any of those events that we talked about or saw in the video on our timeline? I can spot lots of them. So we talked about how we started in 1947 with the first animal sent into space, and they were the fruit flies, and they were on some corn. Then we had the first monkey into space. Then we talked about the dog called Laika who went into space, the first man in space, the first woman in space, our key event that we said we want to remember today, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first people to walk on the moon. In 1991, we've got Helen Sharman becomes the first British astronaut in space, first tourist, that businessman, and then we went to 2015, where Tim Peake became the first British astronaut to visit the International Space Station. So today you're going to have two different jobs to put your timeline together. So I've got my timeline here, and we know that our timeline goes in chronological order, don't we? But our first job is my dates are not matching the pictures. So I would like you to pause the video and see if you can decide, or you might want to do this with your cutouts, which date matches which picture. Off you go. Okay, so whilst you were busy doing that, I was busy matching them too. So I've now matched the pictures to the correct date. And then your activity for today is using the same timeline sheet. You're going to cut out the pictures and the captions with the dates. And I would like you to put them in chronological order onto your timeline. So remember, it's really important that you look at the whole date to help you order it, as lots of them start with 19. So you're going to have to look carefully at the second part of the date to help you. It's probably easiest to start with the one that happened first and then the most recent one, and then you can do the others in between. So I look forward to seeing some pictures of your finished timelines. Bye everyone.